Thanks, Per, for the kind introduction, and thanks very much to the organizers for the invitation. I will touch upon many of the same aspects as Steffen did. I'll try to present perhaps a slightly more cynical view, also in order to ignite the panel discussion afterwards. Just a little bit about myself. As said, I'm a physician and a clinical pharmacologist. I've been the Danish CTP member for about 6 years, and what you're going to hear about is really my experience, because I've seen patient involvement in the licensing process at the European level, at many levels at the EMA. And so I have a sort of I wouldn't say a solid base, but I have a base for having an opinion about patient involvement, what works well and what could work better, where are there opportunities for improvement. I know the EU system quite well for obvious reasons. I have a little knowledge about the US regulatory system. I know that in many respects the FDA, the US system has come perhaps farther than the European system in terms of involving patients in the licensing process. A little bit about my company's policy in terms of engaging with patients. I think what is important is that companies, they create a space for patients where they can freely speak their mind, where they are not intimidated or feel pushed into a certain position or a certain attitude towards a specific problem. The reason why I present this slide, which is not unique to my company, but also to other major pharmaceutical companies, is really not to promote those as being just something that pertain to companies. But I think this sort of code of conduct will actually also work for government institutions, including medical agencies when interacting with patients, about really creating a format where patients are comfortable, where they don't feel intimidated, and where they can freely speak their mind. The good old days, well, medical doctors, they know the interest of their patients. The experts can speak on behalf of their patients, and there's really no need to ask the patients about how they are feeling about their disease and the medicines that we use to treat their disease. Some would say that these are indeed good old days, good days, but I'll come back to that a little later. So what could patient involvement actually mean in drug development and in the licensing process? And here are some examples. So I don't claim that this list is an exhaustive list of all the possibilities. For companies, not only pharmaceutical companies, but also medical device companies, I think patients are key to understand any unmet medical need that there may be. Patient input to the design of clinical trials. I think we have already heard some examples in Zoe's presentation. Steffen, he mentioned that patients are very good at telling us, regulators, whether something is legible, understandable, or not. And of course, one of the prime examples of documentation meant for patients but not being understandable for patients is the patient leaflet, a long list of information which is very hard to understand. Patient-reported outcomes, that means endpoints that we use in clinical studies where we, in an unfiltered way, sort of take in patient input into our clinical database. That's a theme of its own. Let's be honest, patient-reported outcomes, they don't rank very highly among regulators. Most primary endpoints are not patient-reported outcomes. Patient-reported outcomes may be included in clinical trials as secondary or tertiary exploratory endpoints, but they are rarely very high in the pre-specified hierarchy of clinical endpoints in clinical trials. I think that there are some examples where patient-reported outcomes do play a role. For instance, within chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, there are some quite good patient-reported outcomes that have been used for many years and actually play a role also in the licensing process. Quality of life scales are used more and more, and I think they have some bearing. They do have some impact, especially with oncology products where the benefit may be very modest, perhaps just a few months benefit in terms of progression-free survival, plus a quite unfavorable safety and tolerability profile. In those difficult cases, quality of life scale, or at least the ability of a company to show that there's no detrimental effect on quality of life, can sometimes have a regulatory impact. But let's be honest, there's a lot of buzz and hype about PRO's patient-reported outcomes, but they're not used very much in regulatory decision making. I think at the HTA level, there's a more open in the market access authorities, the authorities that are responsible for granting pricing and reimbursement. I think there's perhaps a more open attitude towards patient-reported outcomes. The focus of my presentation is really the licensing process, patients' involvement in the evaluation of benefits and risks, and perhaps also in the final decision making, whether to grant the license or not to a certain medicine. I need to tell you a little bit about how the authorization of medicines, how that takes place in the EU. It's quite complicated, so it will be a very simplified version. You should focus on the centralized procedure. The other procedures, they are quite old, and virtually all medicines with a high technology, high innovation content, they will be licensed via the centralized procedure. It's an EU business, so many Danes will think that medicines are approved by Lægemiddelstyrelsen, the Danish Medicines Agency, but that's actually not the case for medicines authorized via the centralized procedure. The body, the European body that sort of administrates the centralized procedure, that's the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, is located in East London, Canary Wharf in London. It is likely to have to move in the coming years because of the Brexit, but right now it's still in London. Some medicines will all have to be approved by the centralized procedure. For instance, all biologic therapies, all advanced therapies in this context means gene therapy and cell-based therapy. All medications for treating AIDS, for treating cancer, for treating Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, other neurodegenerative diseases will have to go via the centralized procedure. All diabetes products. So for my company, being a diabetes company, we are very familiar with the centralized procedure. Products for autoimmune diseases and also other antiviral agents will have to go via this procedure, as well as medicines for rare diseases, so-called orphan medicines. But there's also a possibility to as a company, to apply, even though your product does not fulfill any of these criteria. You have the possibility as a company to apply. We believe we have a new product that will really add something and address something address a unmet medical need, and companies will then apply, and they will often be granted access to the centralized procedure. What is unique about this procedure is that you'll get one marketing authorization that will be legally binding for the entire EU, plus Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein, which is together the European Economic Area. The scientific assessment will be done by what is also, as Stefan alluded to, the key committee at the EMA, namely the CHMP. It's not the EMA who actually issued the marketing authorization. That marketing authorization is technically done by issued by the European Commission in Brussels. The CHMP, the committee that I used to be a member of until 7 months ago, and that Stefan was a member of, that is the key committee, because that's a committee that makes recommendations to the European Commission about approval of drugs. It's also sort of an appeal committee if countries, member states, and the other procedures cannot come to an agreement. Then the CHMP will make the decision as sort of an appeal committee. Each member state in the EU has got a member, and there are also 5 more members representing a certain expertise. But as you will see, no patient representative. I will come back to that. Decisions in this committee is taken by a simple majority. So even if we, in Denmark, we don't want this drug on our market, if there's a simple majority at the CHMP, then we are forced to have the product on the Danish market. So this is truly a pan-European procedure where member states have a say, but it is a majority vote that really decides whether or not medicine is authorized or not. The assessment process is not carried out by all 28, soon perhaps only 27 member states. 2 rapporteur countries are appointed, and they will sort of have the main task of turning every stone in the application, reading all the documents. And they will set up a team, an assessor team of quality assessors looking at pharmaceutical chemical documentation, and a team of non-clinical assessors looking at all the animal experiments, and a clinical team. And this clinical team will often be composed by a person looking at the efficacy, the benefits of the drug, the safety and tolerability, and there will be a person assigned to look at the risk management plan. It's a 210-day procedure, plus clock stops, because the company will also have to have some time to answer to questions from the CHMP. An average approval time, if the product gets approved, is about 1 year. It's more or less the same also on the other side of the Atlantic in the US. There are often frequent interactions with the FDA during a procedure, because very often the FDA in the US, they are looking at the same product at the same time. So there's a confidentiality agreement between the EMA and the FDA that the 2 agencies can exchange information and viewpoints. But it's not a harmonized verdict that the 2 agencies come to, not in any way. Right. Let's go back to patient involvement. There are lots of terms, and I try to be a little provocative to say there's also a little hype. We've been listening to, we've been hearing about these terms for more than 10 years now, and nobody, neither regulatory agencies or any other government body nor any pharmaceutical industry wants to be perceived as not listening to patients and not wanting to involve patients. So I think there is a risk that these terms may become cliches, and I think it's actually fair to ask the question, why at all involve patients? Why should we listen to patients? I think that is a question that needs to be asked, and I try to come up with what I believe should be the answers, and I see actually only 2 answers, 2 responses to that questions. The first one, and perhaps the first and foremost, is to get better products on the market. Patients, they of course are experts on their own disease, and they may provide valuable input to the evaluation of the benefits and the risks, and to the weighing the benefit against the risks, and in that way it may result in better verdicts by the CHMP or by the FDA or whoever involved patients. We don't know that for sure if that's the case. I think there's some evidence, there's some circumstantial evidence that is indeed the case. Personally, I'm convinced that it is the case, but it's very difficult actually to test conclusively whether the involvement of patients actually get better medicines on the market. And I think that should be the primary goal of involving patients. Secondly, and that's perhaps a more philosophical view, you may say that, well, patients then need to be asked because in any democracy, it's good governmental practice before you take a decision, and the European Commission is sort of a super government body. It is good governmental practice to listen to all the stakeholders, and of course, patients is the ultimate stakeholder. They are the end user for medicine. So you could argue that they have a democratic right to be heard. Stephen, he mentioned that it all started in the 90s or even in the 80s with a lot in the midst of the AIDS epidemic at a time where there were not very many effective or none at all effective medicines. And at some time, the first protease inhibitors had been developed, and there was. I talked to my former colleague at the CHMP yesterday because I knew that he actually personally witnessed the discussion at the CHMP. The name of the CHMP at that time was CPMP, but he actually witnessed the first examples of patients trying to influence decision making at the EMA. The discussion was that at the CHMP at that time was that some of the regulators said they wanted hard endpoints. They wanted effects documented on mortality or severe morbidity, whereas other regulators they wanted a more pragmatic approach to prevail, meaning that that they could rely on surrogate endpoints only. And the chairman of the CPMP at that time, he was French, he was very keen on we need to get these products to the patient. So he invited a number of AIDS patients from the gay community in France, and they stood in front of the CPMP and told the CPMP, you just approve those medicines. We are dying out here, and if you do not approve these medicines, it will be an epic mistake a mistake of epic proportions I'm making. So this is not a direct quotation, but it's a sort of a second-hand account of what actually happened those 20 years ago. These are some pictures from the same situation in the US. The FDA in the US also got a lot of heat from AIDS patients, and some of you perhaps have seen the movie. Has any of you seen the movie Dallas Buyers Club, which is a little bit about these aspects back in the 80s and the 90s. I've skipped the next slides because Stefan has already showed them. But this was, you may say, the beginning of patient involvement. Some of you may have examples of earlier intersections, but at least in my mind, this was really the first major example. These are the committees of the EMA. I've talked about the CHMP already, and Stephen has also addressed some of the other committees. There are actually 7 committees at the EMA. I left out the Veterinary Medicines Committee for obvious reasons. And what stands out is, of course, that the most important committee of all of them, the CHMP, the one the one committee that actually makes the recommendations about licensing of drugs lacks patient representation. There's patient representation in all the other committees except the Committee for Herbal Medicinal Products, Naturmedicin in Danish. So this is I know that this situation is provoking a lot of people. Why is it that patients are not deciding on the approval of medicines in Europe? There's a pilot ongoing, however, at EMA. So patient representatives, they are sometimes involved in CHMP discussion, especially in very controversial cases where there's a split opinion, where the CHMP cannot agree, and where there's a significant unmet medical need. So in those situations, patients may be invited to present their case at the CHMP, but they will be asked to leave the plenary before CHMP starts its final deliberations and starts the voting. So this is the situation. I've also looked a little into the working parties of the EMA and the so-called scientific advisory groups to look whether they have patient representation. And it's not really the case, except for the Patients and Consumers Working Party, which obviously has a lot of patient representatives. The reason why the EMA is not only talking about patients but also about consumers is, of course, that some medicines are not taken by patients but by healthy subjects, vaccines and contraception being good examples. The other working parties and the scientific advisory groups, they don't, as default, have any patient representation. But for some, for instance, the scientific advice working party, that's a very key working party that advises companies on how to develop their medicines, they may, in selected cases, invite a patient representative. In the scientific advisory groups, that's a sort of a group of experts that advises on individual cases in case the CHMP either cannot decide or feel that they don't have the sufficient expertise. A so-called SAC meeting may be convened, and here very often patient representatives are part of the SAC. And I've seen really good patient input in these SACs, and also input that actually had persuasive power to the regulators. But it was still the regulators who took the final decision. I'll skip this one, I think, just to show you that patients are more and more involved in not in the licensing, but in the scientific advice. SA means scientific advice or protocol assistant, and you can here really see that patient involvement in giving advice to companies on how to develop the drugs has I don't know whether skyrocketed is the right phrase, but at least increased over the last couple of years. Now a little bit about my personal experience with patient involvement in the licensing of medicines. I think the first observation I have is that if there's a patient present among regulators and experts, it changes the dynamics of the meeting completely. The expert, it becomes a less, I would say, it becomes a less cynical group. Experts and regulators, they behave, and of course it commands respect that there's actually a person sitting there who know how it feels to who actually feel that particular disease on his or her own body. So that's my first observation. I think the best experience I've seen is when patients, they provide very specific, user-focused input on a very specific, concrete question. It could be something about an efficacy result, an efficacy endpoint compared to what is already on the market. It could be about the clinical meaning of a side effect. Could be PML for an MS product, as Stefan had pointed out, in the context of what the product can accomplish in terms of efficacy. Or it could be some aspects of practical use. To the last bullet, I've seen some examples where patients, they were not really representing the patients that would actually the target of the drug that was under discussion. So it is really an advantage if the patient is well aware of this specific target group of the medicines. The patient may actually suffer from the same disease, but there's so many stages of the disease, and there's so many subgroups of patients, and a certain medicine that may be under discussion, that may be for a very small minority of the overall patient population. Sometimes I've seen examples of patient representatives that didn't have a very profound knowledge of the disease they were actually supposed to provide input about. And that, of course, is a problem. My experience also that general input about the seriousness of the disease and the unmet medical need, that has been less helpful. That can very easily become very emotional, and regulators, they have become very uncomfortable when things get emotional. So I think that has been less successful. My experience is also that most patient representatives, they truly make an effort to represent not only themselves but also fellow patients, and I think that's very good. I've seen some examples where representatives have pursued hobby horses of their own, and that of course is less helpful. But then again, you also sometimes see regulators and experts pursuing their own hobby horses, so that may not be that different. It's very often said that patients are less risk averse of regulators, and the Heisterberg example, that's perhaps an example of where patients have been less risk averse than the regulators. But I've also seen other examples to the opposite. So I don't think you can say that generally patients are less focused on risks than regulators. Here's some challenges as I see them with involving patients in the drug licensing process. There's certainly a potential conflict of interest in terms of affiliation with pharmaceutical industry, and that of course has to be investigated, as it is with any expert that's brought in front of the CHMP. It can be a very intimidating experience for patients to sit with regulators and experts, and I think it's very important that the EMA or the regulator sort of provides an environment that's comfortable for patients, not only the physical environment but also the psychological environment. And that means that a lot of preparations need to be done, mentoring. I know that the EMA, they offer a mentor to patient representatives to make them feel more comfortable. There are some practical issues. I've got an anecdote. I remember a patient representative who suffered from a disease where the skin is very vulnerable to daylight, not only daylight but also artificial light, and we had to turn off the light in the meeting room, so we were sitting almost in complete darkness. Language skills, English language skills are often mandatory, and I think that can actually be a problem because there's a tendency for patient representatives to be almost too polished, very, very good at English, so it very easily becomes an Anglo-Saxon very polished exercise, and there's nothing bad with being Anglo-Saxon, despite my heavy Danish accent. I'm actually half English. But I think it can be a problem in the sense that who actually represents the patient in rural areas of Bulgaria, for instance. So that is something that why I sometimes feel that can I really be sure that this patient representative is really representative of all European patients, because the EMA is a European body and should take care of all patients throughout the European Union. I'm almost at the end now. Sometimes companies, they bring their own patients, and this is indeed a possibility. For example, at an oral explanation, that's something that a company is entitled to if the CHMP is not willing to approve that product. So at the end of the procedure, there might be an oral explanation where the company representatives are asked to stand in front of the CHMP. And sometimes, in rare cases, I've actually seen companies bring in their own patients. This really requires careful consideration by the company, and it's essential that the patients are free to speak their mind, and that they are not sort of staged or choreographed to present a certain company position. My last slide. I think there are many examples where patients have provided valuable input and have been involved in decision making or influenced decision making in a really good manner, and qualified the decision made by regulators. So I'm personally convinced, even though it's difficult to test, I'm personally convinced that there is evidence for the positive contribution or involvement of patients in licensing of medicines. But there are several aspects to take into consideration when bringing patients together with regulators. And I think we are still in our infancy. Perhaps I'm a little too hawkish when talking about infancy. Perhaps I should say adolescence. But I think this really needs to be matured much more than it is today. How do we best structure and organize involvement of patients? Should they be in all committees? Should they have the right to vote, and so forth? Thank you very much for listening.